Um, Welcome everyone to our second session of the Charlottetown Food Council's Conversations About Food series. We are so excited to have you all here today and are really looking forward to the discussions that we will be having this afternoon and over the course of the next 2 weeks in our other sessions. We did have our first session on Monday evening, and there are two more that we'll remind you about that are next week. While we were hoping to convene in person back in March and April, we hope that we have come up with a valuable way of engaging in conversations about our food system in the time of COVID-19. I am Megan Adams, a member of the Charlottetown Food Council, as well as a health promoter in the province's Department of Health and Wellness Chief Public Health Office. I have the wonderful pleasure of moderating today's session. We also have the background tech support, as you know, from John Kimmel, who you just met, Jackie Skayman, our project manager, and Food Council members who will be supporting some of the breakout discussions. So an overview of what you can expect today will be, we'll start with an interview with our guest panelists, then break out into smaller group discussions, and finally come back for a question and answer period. Please use the chat box throughout the session to ask your questions, as we've mentioned, and we hope to get everything covered within the hour that we have allotted, and I will do my very best to keep things moving along to respect your time. I would also like to acknowledge that this is a safe and inclusive space for open dialogue about our local food system and for knowledge sharing. Please be respectful of other participants and please feel free to engage in the conversation in whatever way you feel most comfortable. You can reach out to us in the chat box if you ever have questions throughout. We are pulling up some slides here as I'm talking. Before we begin today's session, I would like to acknowledge that the land that we are calling in from and discussing as it relates to food is in Abegweit, the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. When talking about food, we must ensure that we acknowledge the land which we produce on and its history, and that we honor our peace and friendship treaties. So the goals of these conversations are really to bring community together with their neighbors, community champions, leaders, and experts to start to have a conversation about food, our local systems, and to validate our food asset map and to guide the future work of the Charlottetown Food Council. So speaking of who might be the Charlottetown Food Council, so this is a food council that was established by the city of Charlottetown in 2018, and it's a working group that works in a collaborative manner to tackle issues within the local food system through advocacy, initiatives, and policies. We've got the slides there, so we're right here now. The council's vision is for a vibrant community built on a healthy food system. The council brings together individuals with different backgrounds on food, perspectives, and expertise. Current members, in addition to myself, are Karen Murchison, Morgan Palmer, Phil Ferraro, Brad Durant, Sheena Matthew, Colleen Walton, and Chairperson Bernie Plord. Our city support is the wonderful Katrina Crystal, the Sustainability Officer for the City of Charlottetown. This is a wonderful group of people that I have the honor of working with. They all wear many hats in our community and are all very passionate about improving our local food system. One of the first actions of the Food Council was to develop a food charter, and this is a vision statement that describes what our food system should look like and could look like. It was an important first step to ensure that all action and advocacy policies and projects remain embedded in the Council's values and goals. I'm going to skip through some of this stuff, but our guiding documents can all be found on the City's Food Council website, and I would encourage you to have a look at those. So why are we talking about food asset mapping? Food assets are places where people can grow, prepare, share, buy, receive, or learn about food. They're the resources that already exist in our community, and community mapping is just one way to create a snapshot of what our food system looks like. The reason we would want to do this is to identify existing strengths that we have, to then engage residents, organizations, and decision makers in conversations about our local food system. A local food asset map will also help the Food Council and other food-related organizations to better understand where opportunities may be to improve the system, sustainability, and inclusivity through partnerships, policies, and projects. So when talking about today's theme, the hope of this series is to touch on a number of different themes of our food charter and food asset map. But our first theme on Monday evening, we talked about production, distribution, and receiving food. Today, we are talking about learning and celebrating, and this is meant to highlight and celebrate our incredible individual and community level assets and to ensure that our local food system is as inclusive and as it is sustainable. The goal of this session is to provide a platform for members of our BIPOC community to discuss how culture, policy, and projects may adversely and disproportionately affect some members of our community, as well as to understand the historical and cultural significance of the land that we produce on. It's also an opportunity to perhaps celebrate some of those local food assets and what a food system may mean for different groups. This is an important theme, and I want to acknowledge that this is by no means a solution to improving our local food system. The hope is that this is the first of many conversations that translate into real, inclusive, and sustainable action. So our panelists today, we are delighted to have some incredible panelists with us this afternoon. They are strong community champions within our local community and food system and have a wealth of knowledge to bring to the table for this theme. First, we have Tara Reeves, and she is a chef and registered holistic nutritionist that helps clients transition to whole food and plant-based diets so that they can confidently take control of their health. Tara is a passionate advocate for sustainability, sovereignty, and justice within BIPOC community food systems. We are so excited to have you join us today, Tara. Welcome. Next, we have Claire Byrne, and she is a community member and activist, growing up in PEI in a mixed PEI and Dominican family. Bringing community together over food was something that happened all the time. Her activism really started through co-founding the Panther Pantry Food Collective while a student at UPEI. After hearing stories of her peers going to class hungry, dumpster diving, and taking food from their budget to cover the costs of classes and textbooks with some friends, they decided to look to ways to bring food to hungry students. Thanks for joining us today, Claire. And next we have Melody Swan, and she is a registered dietitian working as a health promotion coordinator in Abegweit First Nation Wellness Center for the last 4 years. She has a passion for food and helping others to see the potential within themselves for making healthy decisions. Helping identify and remove barriers to enhance a healthy environment on both an individual and community scale is what she does on a daily basis. Welcome, Melody. And finally, also joining us today is Brezlyn Knockwood. Melody and Brezlyn are sharing the screen there. Brezlyn is a Mi'kmaq First Nation man who was born and raised in Charlottetown and currently resides in the Scotchford Reserve. He has worked with Epekwitk Gardens and Preserves for 6 years, moving from being mentored in life skills through to farming to a manager of the organization. We are incredibly excited to have you join us today as well, Brezlyn. So I'm so excited to have the opportunity to speak with you and listen to you all this afternoon. I think you all bring very different food backgrounds and perspectives and are going to complement each other so well. I'll get things started off maybe with a fairly broad question for you all, and that would be, what does a local food system mean to you, and perhaps what it should look like? So maybe we'll start with Tara, and then we can move on.
Hi everyone, thanks for having me. For me, this local food system looks like a lot of different things to me. I grew up here in Prince Edward Island, and I really, appreciate the abundance that we have here on our small island and the things that we are able to produce. And a food system is a very complex thing in a lot of different ways. And that's all I'm going to say about that for now, because I know we're going to get into the layers of what that looks like a little later in the conversation. So I will just say that the Prince Edward Island food system is very dear to my heart as a chef, obviously, and as someone who did grow up here. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thanks, Tara. Maybe we'll move on to Claire.
Yeah, thanks, Meg. I think growing up on PEI and doing the work that we were doing on campus, I think one of the things that is like really special about the PEI kind of food system is that there is plenty of food to go around here. We're very lucky to live on an island that has so many great producers and such an abundance of food. And I think, as Tara said, we kind of get into what that looks like in practice and how we distribute that in kind of like a fair and just way in other questions. But yeah, I think PEI is really special in what it has to offer.
That's great, thanks. Maybe we'll move on to Brezlyn there, and Melody, you can follow up after.
So the local food system means to me is having a sense of security, having food security, something that we don't have to worry about, especially going through the times that we're going through now. Everything seems fairly unstable. So to have a sense of security when it comes to food is definitely something that we should definitely appreciate. And we're very fortunate to have the ability to grow everything here on the island. It's just for people to understand, especially in our small community, the potential that's on our land. And with having everything here on the island, you're keeping local economy. So you have locals supporting locals, you have small families supporting small families. And I think that's the biggest thing for me is connecting with other farmers and understanding how hard they worked for their dollar. I don't mind spending my dollar on them because I know it's going to something extremely well. So
I echo everything that he says, but I think a big thing with the local food system is also convenience. That's something that I struggle with, and along with a lot of other people, but even making connections within your community and having local farmers, local organizations that are willing to show what they have and show what they offer, I think that is really important.
That's so great. I think that really all those answers really touch on why we're talking about strengths in our community as well. But all that's to say, when we were planning this series, there are so many themes that could be touched on. And we felt when talking about food production and practices within the system, we cannot avoid the implications of colonization on food. That's across Canada, but as well as here in PEI. And so the next question I'd like to ask you all is, in your view, how do the legacies of colonization have impacts on food production and sovereignty for BIPOC communities and racialized folks, both in Canada, but also right here in Prince Edward Island? And perhaps if you're comfortable, we'll go in the same order. So maybe Tara can kick things off.
Well, I think it'd be easier to look at how they don't have a legacy. That's pretty much it, right? So when we look at the food system and when we look at colonization, it's like this. We can't have one without the other, unfortunately. In a macro scale, food sovereignty is possible. However, here in Canada and here in Prince Edward Island, as we know, Prince Edward Island is a province that really champions the colonial history. We continue to celebrate the Victorian era and that kind of thing. We really take pride in that history, and we really begin to see that trickle-down effect of how colonization is interwoven into our society in every single way. So there's a lot to unpack, obviously, but we have to start somewhere, right? We have to acknowledge that we do exist in this colonized system. There's no way to look at it with a different lens. That's how we exist in our Western societies, right? So like Brezlyn was saying, going back to local food producers and that kind of thing, we're very lucky to live in a place where we do have such an abundance and, rich soil and that kind of thing. But then we have to look at, okay, well, who's running our food system, right? Who are the people in power and have the ability to make food policy and decisions for everyone else, right? I'm confident to say that they're not people that look like me, and that has a huge impact on people that look like me, right? So it's interwoven so tightly and carefully, intentionally, that we really need to use that same intention and care to look at the ways that it affects our food system on a provincial level, on a national level, on a North American level, and where we fit into that piece as far as a nation in our world, right? The effects are very harmful, especially for people that look like myself, right? So what do we do with that information, right? It's evident, it's very obvious that we exist in a system that has been colonized. So where do we begin to unpack that? Where do we begin to have the conversation that everyone feels comfortable having, right? And doing the work instead of just having the conversation.
Absolutely. That's so great, Tara. Thank you so much. Claire, would you like to build on that a little bit more as well?
Yeah, I think something that I was just thinking about as Tara was speaking was also just kind of Canada and PEI's history and in relying on the work of migrant workers to help produce the food in our food system. And I think, and this might also kind of lead into some other questions that I'm sure we'll talk on, but it's just looking at how much we rely on these workers. So to come seasonally and kind of exploit that labor for a short amount of months and offer very little recourse. And that it has kind of like a direct, connection to colonization, like Canadian kind of imperialism. And it's like it is really awful, the treatment of our like BIPOC neighbors, like PEI is so small. We've definitely come in contact with lots of people who have come here for summer months to help produce our food that we're, enjoying and celebrating, and then only to go back to their homes with no kind of easy way to citizenship or residency in PEI or Canada. And now, with COVID, there's been a ton of stories from across the country of laborers and migrant workers that have come here, contracted COVID and been sent home, or, have spoken out about their treatment where they're working, and then to lose their status and their employment. And I think we've created this system in a way that's built so unfairly, and, it's just so exploitative. I think it's like that's part of talking about these food systems that I think is kind of easy to forget, I think, because of how we treat these people. And I think that is a kind of direct relation to how Canada has kind of built itself.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, Claire. That's a really great point. And I think we'll move on. Same question to Brezlyn and Melody to speak to that question as well.
So one big impact I think it's having is the impact on the land. I think I'm getting the right terminology with the question. I'm making sure with something like that, our land is extremely important. So what I think the way that we're doing things now is something that could hurt us, not our generation, but future generations to come. So whenever I have some teachings from some elders, the respect of the land is always there. So with everything that I do as far as farming, we make sure that we respect our elders and we don't use things like herbicides, pesticides, anything like that. We want to make sure that we're doing it the same way they did it years ago, but we have trackers besides horses, things like that. We want to commend them because they did it the right way. They took care of the soil because they knew the soil would take care of them in the long run. They tried their hardest to make sure that we had the nutritious soil that we have today. So whenever I think of the way that we're moving now, everything like that is thrown out the window. It's quantity over quality. They don't care what nutrition's in the soil because you can put a little pellet on at the beginning of every year to give you the nutrition back in the soil. And I think nowadays for future generations to learn what past generations have done for us to have the privilege to have this land, I think we need to acknowledge that a lot more. We'll understand how they grew food, how they stored food, what they did with food. And I feel like we would appreciate what we have a whole lot more if we understood what they did.
From a dietitian point of view, working in a First Nation community, I see a lot of diabetes and related health effects like that. And this question just reminded me of colonization bringing in the white foods. So sugar, fat, salt, milk, flour, all those very high, dense foods that those individuals weren't used to at the time, and just taking traditional food and changing it for the people here, and over generations, just having the downfalls of that change.
Thanks for this insight. I think all of those, again, you complement each other all so well. I think you all touched on a number of aspects that we really need to be talking about here in PEI and at the neighborhood community level as well. So I hope participants are able to take from this conversation everything that you've said and reflect on just that. So whether you're a food producer growing a backyard garden or buying food from a market, it's important to think about these implications and how these affect some groups in our communities, and as Brezlyn mentioned, for generations to come. So I'm conscious of time, and we're just going to shift gears a bit. Given the challenging year that we've all had, I'd like you to touch on, did the COVID-19 pandemic have potential disproportionate impacts on certain communities in Charlottetown or outside of Charlottetown, if that's where you're calling in from, when it comes to food security? And how can we do better in the future, whether it's a future pandemic or whether it's just addressing day to day that level of food security at all levels? So maybe we'll go in the same order. Tara, if you want to take it from.
Thank you. Well, I think it's fair to say that Black and Brown communities already disproportionately face food insecurity. So therefore, the question in itself is kind of, I don't want to say redundant, but right, of course they did. You know, we have international students here that are just caught in the balance of waiting, you know what I mean? Like their housing's affected, and I will pass the mic to Claire on that. She can touch on that in a little bit more depth. But I mean, of course, Black and Brown communities and Indigenous communities were affected disproportionately by a global pandemic. Specifically, Black and African descent folks have been living in a pandemic for about 400 years now, right? And the name of that pandemic is racism, right? So we've got layer upon layer of challenges and barriers to food security, to employment, to shelter, to resources at the community ground level, right? So, I mean, the obvious answer is yes, of course. But the obvious question is, what do we do to make sure that that doesn't continue to happen, right? And hopefully we can scratch the surface on that today, but there's a lot of work to be done within the community level kind of access towards food to make sure that everyone is secure, right? Not just middle-class white people that have a family doctor, right? We really need to look at the population of people who live here in a very grand way. And we also need to look at who is sitting at the table making these decisions and policy for everyone, right? So
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Tara. That's great. You spoke to that question so spot on, and I think I know Claire probably has some things that you want to build on to some of the international students. So if you would like to touch on that.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for starting us off, Tara. But yeah, you're exactly right. I think in the work that we were doing at UPEI, so this is also, we were talking about kind of food security numbers, like 4 years ago when I was in my undergraduate. And it was like, you know, in PEI, it's been kind of well documented that PEI Islanders experience higher rates of food insecurity than a lot of the rest of the country. And then within that, you know, international students are kind of the highest food insecure kind of demographic. So it's like, and that was, you know, that's speaking to the fact that international students are being asked to pay like 2 and 3 and 4 times higher tuition rates than domestic students. And then on top of that, you know, what's been going on with COVID right now, international students were totally left in limbo, exactly what Tara was saying, because, you know, we all know that PEI is probably one of the safest places to be in the whole world. So thinking of just kind of when things started to happen with COVID, people are unable to go home, they're staying here, they've probably lost their income. And then there's no, of the emergency supports that were offered, international students were totally left behind, you know. And then these institutions, so UPEI and Holland College specifically now, are still asking their students to pay such high rates of tuition with no emergency supports and no long-term supports, you know. And we've seen in Charlottetown alone, there's been like 4 different students that have crowdfunded their tuition costs, and they were all international students, they're all students of color. And that's of just who we know, you know, and that's of people, you know, that have reached out to the Black Cultural Society or BIPOC Usher publicly. And then there's like a whole whole bunch of students that have reached out privately. I think BIPOC Usher had a fundraiser running since March to support international students, and the asks are still coming in. You know, so again, when we're thinking of how this has disproportionately affected these populations, it's obvious, like Tara said, like these populations were experiencing food insecurity already. Now we're, you know, there's like no supports for international students, still the same kind of expectation to pay these really high rates of tuition, and you know, it's everything's just kind of doubled down on these populations. So short answer, yes. You know, it has disproportionately affected a lot of people.
Absolutely. And I think you make a great point there in terms of we're safe and comfortable in PEI in terms of perhaps our level of COVID exposure. But pre-COVID, this was an issue for many communities, and we're talking about opening restaurants and those kind of things, but there are still, you're talking about tuition. How are people paying for food and all of those things? So I'm really glad that you touched on that. Melody and Brezlyn, would you like to touch on that question? Were there disproportionate impacts that you'd like to speak about when it comes to food security, both before COVID, but emphasizing COVID-19 right now as a means to find solutions?
Actually, I think this is a better question for Melody as far as like the terminology goes with everything.
I was thinking about this question, and I want to kind of put a spin on it. The community here is definitely struggles with food insecurity, but I find with a lot of like grants and things like that we apply for food or other projects like that or programs, there's a lot of stipulations or regulations around that money using the food in the community. And something that me and some coworkers were actually chatting about was through COVID and some emergency relief funds, there's definitely less less guidelines and more focused on how the community wants to use it. So I've been kind of grateful for that, for the community members, and chatting with them and seeing what they would need and what they would like to see and kind of bringing that about. And Byrne would know we've been partnering with the Charlottetown Farmers Market to bring food baskets to people to like once or twice a month. And it's just been really eye-opening to see that something can be so in the community's hands and that they can take control of that, and we can do something that people actually want to see.
I think that is a really important point to make, that the funding structures for a lot of these issues that we're talking about, you know, what are the solutions, accessing funding, a lot of the structures are really rigorous. They take a lot of energy and time to complete. And so I think that's probably a good segue to my next question. So thanks, Melody. And that would be, what are some of the ways that community and those in leadership roles, so positions of power, you know, there's other issues that we've talked about here already today about those positions of power, but those that are in those leadership roles, how can they ensure policies and projects are inclusive, respectful of cultural practices, differences, and do not harm disproportionately certain members of our community? You want to go in the same order, maybe?
So there's two parts to my answer. On what was just said, we need to question why certain communities need to access funding so that they have food. The second part is, I'm going to go back and reread your question. For specifically speaking for the Black community here, we're a small-ish community spread across the entire island, right? With the predominant population residing in Charlottetown. We live in an era where we continue to see the first Black person in space and the first Black woman, whatever, right? And I can confidently say I don't ever want to be the first Black person to do anything, right? It's 2020. We need people from our community in positions of power, in positions of leadership, leading our ship, right? We've been led here by people outside of our community. And now here we are trying to fix this, right? So another thing I would say is, for the white folks listening, we need white people to get out of the way. And I'm saying that from my heart, in a, as professional as I can say it, we really need white people to get out of the way, because we're here for a reason. The systems that we exist in are clearly not functioning for everyone. And there's no way to look past that at this point, right? There's no way to look past the fact that these disproportions exist in our communities. We continuously have to jump higher, because every time the bar is set, it's raised again when we come to the table, right? And we just need to acknowledge that we exist in a system of white supremacy. And once we can acknowledge that and accept that, I think then we can start to look at, how do we get people like me and people like Claire that look like us in these positions of leadership, right? But until then, I don't fully feel, and especially here in Prince Edward Island, because we are such a small province, because we are so heavily colonized, and because we are a relatively small BIPOC community, it seems intangible at times to talk about things like food security in the Black community, food sovereignty in the Black community, because we're just such a small community in numbers, right? But those are the types of things that we need to start looking at, and we are. However, on top of that, as I said before, with this 400-year pandemic, we've got work to do. We're traumatized, we're tired, we're trying to toe the line, right? And we're in our everyday lives, we're continuing to run up on this oppression, right? So my saying is, nothing can be for us without us, right? The government can't create a program and say, okay, let's help the Black community without the Black community making those decisions. That's not, it doesn't work that way, right? But that's a system that we've existed in for the last however many hundreds of years. So nothing can be for us without us. We need to show up, we need to organize, and in tandem with that, we need white people to get out of the way and listen and show up.
That's great. Thanks so much, Tara. Yeah, I'm happy we're starting this conversation, and hopefully it's the first of many, but then it translates into actual action, which is the most critical part after that. So Claire, would you like to build on that one a little bit more?
Yeah, thanks, Tara. Yeah, I guess I was thinking kind of in line with what Tara is saying is, like, I think recognizing that all of these issues of like food sovereignty and food security, they wasn't caused by COVID. It's kind of been really highlighted how deep kind of these inequities go right now, I think, with COVID. And kind of three things that I was thinking of, just kind of sitting with this question, is like things like tangible things that we can do right now is like, well, speaking to, the realities of international students on PEI, like pathways to citizenship are very important. For international students, their visas are tied to their staying in school and doing well in school, and then once they graduate, there's like a really short window of being able to stay in this country, and it's really awful because we've seen examples of this in PEI, where like if you're unable to go to school for whatever reason, then your status in this country is then affected. And then so how that relates also to COVID right now is that, there's a lot of students who are on PEI where their homes have been totally kind of like just really profoundly affected by COVID-19. They've like lost, their families have lost their incomes. They've like had to, had to move, have had to, go into lockdown and all these things. And then they're in Charlottetown being expected to pay such high tuition. So I think I think we should absolutely be going to UPEI and Holland College and asking them, what are you doing for your students? Offering, leniency in terms of paying tuition, but, it's an online school semester and they're still expected to pay thousands and thousands of dollars. And if they cannot, then they cannot go to school and therefore have to go home. And it's just like, that's just like so deeply kind of unequal and unjust. So that's one thing I think we should be doing. The other thing too, speaking to kind of the other questions too, is like, minimum wage on PEI right now is what, $12.85. We saw, I think everyone saw that article that said tuition, wages, like a livable wage in PEI should be around, $20 an hour, not 12. And then again, kind of speaking to the fact that BIPOC communities are already facing, higher levels of food insecurity, and what prevents your access to food is your income, and so I think something else we should absolutely be advocating for is higher minimum wages. It's been, and again, PEI is really wonderful for a lot of things, but it is really based on who you know. And I think being able to access even like emergency response kind of networks and stuff like that is still based on who you know. And then again, when we're talking about people who are moving here to study, they don't have access to those networks already. So yeah, I think that's a couple of things we have to be thinking about. And then thinking of just migrant workers again is creating again those pathways to citizenship and making sure that their health and safety isn't tied to their employer. Because that is also kind of perpetuates these really unequal systems that already exist.
Thanks so much, Claire. Brezlyn and Melody, anything that you'd like to add to that? How we can ensure those in leadership roles are ensuring that policies and projects are inclusive and respectful, and acknowledging the fact that there are disproportionate impacts?
Again, as a Mi'kmaq First Nation, we're very fortunate that we have not just the Canadian government, but the government of Prince Edward Island. They acknowledge the fact that they are on Mi'kmaq land. So we're very fortunate for that. It's been years of reconciliation and trying to coexist with each other. That's been the struggle. And just understanding like our morals and where we actually came from. It's to have the people actually sit down and listen to elders in the community to understand like how do you respect them? Like how can you make sure that what we're doing now is what they envisioned as a child, because everything was drastically changed for them at a very young age. But as far as this question goes, I think Melody can elaborate a lot better than I can.
Well, I'll continue on that. I think a big thing is to just know the community, and if a policymaker of any kind is making something, it needs to be coming from the people. So if whoever is coming in to make change or to facilitate it or anything, it's to use the voices of the people. Like Abegweit here knows what they want, they know what they need. And it's just giving the voice to them and being able for them to present their ideas in the right spot, and just giving them, empowering them to use it and to just share their knowledge is a huge thing.
Absolutely. So we are significantly a little bit over time from what I had planned, and that's okay. The flow of this conversation, it's exactly why we're here. And so maybe just I can open the floor for maybe 1 minute between all of you to sort of throw in last minute thoughts. Brezlyn, one question that I had specific to you that you may speak to as well is what are some ways that we can reintegrate the importance of connection to land into our local food system as well? So I'll leave it, maybe Brezlyn, if you want to start there, and then the rest of you could throw in quick last thought before we move into the next portion.
I think it's going to be about teaching our youth, like the importance of the land. Ever since I started gardening, we've had a lot of elders come up to the garden asking what we're doing because they haven't seen farmland here on the reserve since they were a kid. And whenever there was farmland here, it was owned by a white man that lived in the community. So to hear their teachings and to understand how much they respect the land, to pass that on to future generations is really going to be the only thing that is going to make sure that we're going to have usable land for years to come, because I'm the only person in my generation that's willing to farm and that knows a little bit about the land, and I've
You know a lot.
the opportunity to learn from elders.
That's great. Any final thoughts from the rest of you there? And then we'll move on to the next session.
Just to touch on what Brezlyn said there, just regarding the land and like thinking about sustainability and that kind of thing, I think we're in a really precarious situation where we've overfished the Atlantic Ocean. Let's be honest about that. We're a world-class agricultural producer, but to what detriment to the land that we reside on, right? It's a large question that needs to be looked at from a lot of different angles, but in my opinion, the only answer to that question is giving the land back. There's no way that we can have these conversations about food security, about production, about agriculture, about colonization, about land use and sustainability without talking about giving the land back. Period, right? So with what Brezlyn's saying that his, elders have never seen someone from their community, it's always the white man, right? And if we look around, if you drive tip to tip on this island, tell me one Black owned or Indigenous owned farm that you see. Think about that, right? Like that's a huge issue. And we can't have these conversations without addressing that. Mm-hmm. It doesn't work. And I think there's a bit of cognitive dissonance there when we do try to do that. It's like we can't talk about reconciliation without talking about colonization. We can't talk about potential food systems and potential sustainability without talking about colonization. We can't talk about colonization without talking about the detriments of Indigenous peoples, of their land, right? Like it's all connected. And I do think that the land back is one thing that people like to skirt around and not acknowledge, because what does that mean, right? What does that mean for us at a municipal level, provincial level, national level, right? I know it obviously makes some people uncomfortable to think about what that would look like, right? But I do want to make a point to say that we can't have these conversations without having that conversation.
Absolutely. I'm so glad that you said that, Tara. And I hope that everyone listening today is thinking about that. Who are the people in positions of power, and do we know who has, as you said, Tara, who owns a farm that might be Black or Indigenous?
Another point, if I may.
Go ahead. Yeah, I'm just gonna roll with it. We can. We're here to listen to you guys today.
In tandem with everything I just said, another point I want to talk about is equity, right? We often talk about racism and discrimination in relation to equality, which in a lot of people's mind is directly in tandem with white supremacy and whiteness, right? So when we talk about equality, equal to whom, right? And first of all, who came up with this idea, and who's it for, and who's it by, right? I, as a mixed race Black woman, I don't want equality. I don't want to feel equal or be looked at as equal to white people. That's not my standard, right? However, as a mixed race Black woman, I do want equity. I do want to own land. I do want to be able to provide for my family and leave a legacy for my family. And again, that goes back to talking about land back to Indigenous peoples, right? Who I'm still a settler. My descendants are still, or my ancestors are still settlers on this land, even though I am African Nova Scotian descendant, right? So it's a very complex thing, but I do want to make the distinction between equality and equity. They're not the same thing. They are absolutely not the same thing. And in our Black communities, we need to own our own, right? And that lends to food sovereignty, that lends to food security. Again, in saying that nothing can be for us without us, right? And again, that's equity. I don't want to just go work on a white person's farm. I want to own the farm, right? I want to own whatever it is that I'm producing to go to market, to have an equitable stake in the market, right? So I just want to make that distinction between equity and equality. They're absolutely not the same thing. And we need to be talking more about equity than equality, right?
Absolutely. I'm so glad that you said that, Tara. I think that everyone listening today too needs to ensure that they're holding people, groups, organizations, leaders accountable, that they're addressing equity and not equality. Absolutely. Claire, did you want to weigh in, or did we want to move on?
No, it's all
I'll
good.
leave it up to you.
I think Tara captured all the things.
Okay. We'll come back shortly too, but we're gonna pull up. Oh, sorry, I just muted myself. We're going to pull up a very quick video. We do have 10 minutes remaining in the session, so we're going to reduce what will be the breakout sessions, but that's okay. This is the start of a conversation. John's going to put some instructions in the chat box there, and I think he's going to pull up a quick video of the food asset map for us to watch. And this is just a snapshot of what it will be. So just bear with us, it's coming up here. It's muted. Welcome back, everyone. We're starting to trickle back in. So I know that we're right at 3 o'clock here, a few minutes over. So if you do have to leave, we will be sending out an email with some reminders. We do have some upcoming sessions, some surveys, particularly evaluation about these sessions. And I would love to see some of you participate in the next week's sessions as well. So reminders will be going out there if you're comfortable and able to stay for a few extra minutes. And I think, I don't know that we've touched on this, but this conversation is put on by the Charlottetown Food Council. And so we are talking about a food asset map specific to Charlottetown, recognizing though that PEI is a really unique community. I know you've all touched on that, you know, we talk about things on the provincial level, but talking about things on each municipal level. So you've mentioned Summerside there, and the hope is that we can start this conversation at a whole provincial level in Charlottetown, and also something that's really important is at the neighborhood level. What do from neighborhood to neighborhood, you know, what does that look like? You can talk about Charlottetown as a whole, but some neighborhoods look very different from others. So that's a great point. I know that. I thought I saw a question, but that's okay. Any thoughts, Brezlyn and Melody, that you want to weigh in there? Just any final thoughts at all from your group discussions at all?
Again, like we don't live in Charlottetown, but like I think we're extremely fortunate here in our community to have something like the garden, which is our biggest asset as far as food goes. So this is something that people can feel free to go to the garden whenever they want to pick food. All we do is we let them know potatoes are ready, carrots are ready, and we have everything labeled fairly good to where people just have the freedom to go in there and pick whatever they want. This is their land, it's their community, it's their food. So I think we're extremely fortunate for that.
And even with the garden, linking that with like the daycare programs that we have, kids going down there, learning how to do things, very hands-on. It's awesome having elders meals with those produce. It's really cool to put that ownership in the food.
And the kids get to taste the food at a very young age. To have these kids like acquire a taste for green food at a young age is something that's very important. So we do a lot of, again, like catering events, but I've done a lot of cooking events, open fire events at the daycare. I would usually go out and catch a salmon or a striped bass or a trout, and I would go collect and harvest out of the garden. We would go out there and have fresh food. So these kids, they eat whatever you eat. They're following behind you. You pick a yellow bean and they're calling it a little banana, and they're enjoying it just as much as you are. So it's something satisfying that I don't think you can, put into words. So
Absolutely. Two great things that you highlight there. I hope that the school food program that's happening right now, I think that's part of the conversation, right? Is at an early age, getting different foods into to children's mouths,
Yeah.
because that's what's really important. Is from an early age they know that. And I just need to boast about the gardens and Abegweit First Nation and the connections that you all make there. I think it's one of PEI's sort of best kept secrets. I just admire all the work that you do there. So thanks for joining us. And Claire, any final thoughts that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I was just kind of thinking, kind of going on what Brezlyn's talking about, is community gardens have been, it's like such a beautiful way for people to access kind of local food and feel like they're really a big part of it. Like I know growing up, growing up downtown Charlottetown, there was a community garden just kind of up the street on where we lived, and that got paved over to make way for condos. So when we're talking about neighborhoods that have access to making, creating community gardens, like I think it's like a really tangible thing that we can be going to the city of Charlottetown and saying, like, in downtown and like X amount of area, is there a community garden, and like demanding that there should be, it's like it's really incredible. The other thing that I was just thinking about also, and I kind of was talking to Tara about this earlier this week, but I live in a co-op in downtown Charlottetown, and there are like multiple families that, they have access to transportation, so are able to they have a kind of a plot of land outside of the city, and they're able to go and harvest, and that feeds a family all year round. Like it's like incredible, and it's been this really beautiful thing in this community, specifically because then it becomes like, the neighbors upstairs bring us like a bag of tomatoes, and I bring them some jam, and it's like a really beautiful way for like the BIPOC community to be able to kind of share resources. So, and that all stems down from like, having access to that land and being able to harvest it and plant it and take care of it. And then in turn, all the beautiful things kind of stream off of that. So those kids, now know how to harvest tomatoes, and like, what does that look like? How do you preserve them? All those things. And I mean, and the kids are very funny. They don't necessarily appreciate that, but I think in years to come they will, and it's become a beautiful thing for our community here where I live.
Thanks, Claire. I think that's honestly such a great way to maybe close out today, because you touch on a few things that we're talking about. The reason we're having these conversations about food, just to get people talking about food, but also looking at what we have. We've talked a lot about of the issues that we have in our system, and today's theme being learning and celebrating, certainly celebrating those assets that we have. And there may be the well-known sort of retailer and those kind of things that we're aware of, but to that point, Claire, that you make about the programs that happen organically and at the ground swelling neighborhood community level, that's really what we're hoping to see, and continue to build on some of those resources that already exist in the community. And how can we get every sort of neighborhood block engaging in conversations about food and acting in the same ways. So I think that's such a nice way to close out today. I know that we're a little bit over time, so thanks for those of you who stayed, and thank you for taking the time. I think this is a really great way to start the conversation. We've talked about how it's not the solution. The food asset map is hopefully a way for Food Council to look at some of the gaps, to build on some of the strengths that we do have, and to build from there. But certainly this particular theme and the conversation that we're having today, we've barely scratched the surface here. And I just feel so fortunate to have had the four of you come talk with us today. I think you saw some of the Mentimeter answers flowing in, and just in the interest of time, I'm just going to probably wrap it up and not show those, but we'll maybe send a screenshot out or something out later. But the idea behind that question, really thinking about what the best food asset is in your neighborhood, why is it important to you, and what does that mean? Is it something that everyone else can access, or only some groups or neighborhoods? These are the conversations that we're wanting to have, and to build on some of those resources, whether they're individual assets, community assets, businesses, all of those kind of things. How can we support our producers all the way to our eaters? So with that, we've pulled up a little reminder slide here for you. And I just want to remind you that we do have some more conversations happening. So this is 2 of 4. We have 2 more next week on December 1st and 3rd. And we'll be talking, the third session will be about neighborhood level projects. So we're sort of starting to get into that here at the end here, but neighborhood level projects and how we can support that sort of action at that smaller scale level to build community in that way. And then the last session being how can we celebrate food? So we do have some awesome events in PEI talking about celebrating island food in a way that's really wonderful, but how do we get that 365 days of the year and support local every single day? And in talking today, how can we support BIPOC business owners and producers more too. So stay tuned for those sessions. Stay tuned for a launch of the food asset map. We will send out the snapshot and there should be a way to provide feedback as well eventually. So stay tuned for that. We hope to launch the map as a tool for community to use early 2021. And as you know, there is a food questionnaire that's out and available for community members to use. There are physical copies in locations around Charlottetown for those who do not have access to the internet. So reach out if you have questions there, and there will be an email with all of this as reminders, but an evaluation survey just so that we can get a sense of how the event was and make improvements for future events too. So again, it's not the first, not a solution, it's the first step. And we hope you'll participate in the rest of the series. We know there are limitations to people participating online as well, but hopefully we can provide more opportunities in the future. Thank you so much to John in the background and Jackie for their support, Bernie and Katrina for moderating today, and our wonderful panelists. This day was amazing. Thanks to the 4 of you. So we really appreciate you joining us. And thank you everyone who participated. So with that, I'll hopefully see you next Tuesday, December 1st for our next session. Merci, Willalin and gracias. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.